Auditor General of South Africa, thank you very much for taking time to be part of us. Honorable members and the guest media, they're very important. Linda will fight me if I don't recognize you guys. Welcome, everybody who's here. The objective of today's meeting is from the FFC. If I said they're here, PBO. This brief of 2020, which is for us to consider and adopt the report as a committee. In terms of Section 4, subsection 4C, the Money Bill Bills Amendment and Related Matters Act of 2009, as amended in 2018, requires that in order for us to consider money bills, the committee must consider recommendations of the Financial and Fiscal Commission. We must underline that the important role that the FFC is playing in as far as the Appropriation Bill is concerned. That is mandatory. Section 15, subsection 2A of the Parliamentary Budget Office reviews and analysis of the documentation which means the minister. It must further provide advices and analysis on proposed amendments, if any. Members, it is against this background that I've just given briefly that today's meeting will hear the submission from these two key stakeholders before we report on the 2020 Appropriations Bill to the House. We should also remember that unlike the Division of Revenue Bill, which is Section 76, the appropriations we allocate resources horizontally across government and that require provision. That's the appropriation bill, what we are doing today. However, our key focus on the bill as a select committee on appropriation is specifically on the transfer allocations earmarked for some provincial departments, provincial projects, and local government as the National Council of Provinces. That is why we do not spend too much time and dwell too much on the bill and without compromising the independence of the NCOP. I know members have complaining about independence of the NCOP.
Chairperson, we are struggling to hear you.
IT, can you assist? The members are saying are struggling to hear me. Honorable Ryder, I did apologize about my voice when we started. I'll try everything possible to make sure that I'm audible, I'm louder, and use my short voice. So I'm requesting honorable members that we are familiar with the protocols of the visual meetings, and I don't expect members to shout unless there's something drastic that will let you to shout. There's a group in the WhatsApp that is called management. Use that for raising hands we have people who will be checking on those groups or those lines to see who wants to speak. And honorable members, please, let's try by all means to make sure that we don't take unnecessary time and don't make preambles when we make the I'm now going to request Lubabalo Notata to give us apologies, if any.
Thank you, Chairperson. Good morning, honorable members and colleagues. Chairperson, I received only one apology from Honorable Mr. Njato. He will join us a little bit later. He is currently chairing another meeting now, Chair.
Thank you very much. That's the only apology that we have received officially. Anything that came as an emergency from other members that you have been informed of as an apology? Nothing.
Nothing so far, Chairperson. All other members have joined except Umama Rahane. So as soon as we have passed this stage of the meeting, I'm going to try and liaise with her and check what's happening on her side.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Honorable members, I'm now going to hand over to Prof, who is leading FFC. I don't know if is it you, Prof, who's going to make a presentation or whoever. You can also please introduce the team that is with you. Over to you, Prof. And members, I hope you have received the presentations somewhere last week, if I'm not mistaken. If the presentation on the screen is low, please use the presentation that you have received. Thank you very much. Over to you, Prof.
Morning, Chairperson and honourable members. Chairperson, honourable members, we send you basically 3 reports, all in one. The one was a narrative report so that you can read the storyline that we're presenting to you. And based on that storyline, we also gave you a number of 70 slides which will also help you to work through quicker through the report that I've given you. And today and yesterday we then give you the 20-odd slides, which is the ones that we're presenting today. So all 3 needs to be read into one. This is just a much more quicker and fast tracking you through the whole report. But I want to say from the outset, the slides doesn't detract or diminishes the importance of the narrative report, because it's actually better to read through that one slowly in your time to be able to understand some of the other nuances and key arguments we're putting forward. Chair, we're competing against a storm in Cape Town. So I'll try, if I get cut off, then I'll ask one of the staff that's with me just to carry on where I stopped. We will be 3 people speaking. I will do the introductory and I'll come back to you at the end. Shen Chen will do the first part of it. Dr. Kululi Ngube will do the second part, and I'll come back to you at the end. I don't know whether our CEO is in this meeting because he's sick. I'm giving an apology on that part. He just phoned me now that he's not feeling well. But that's the team that's going to talk to you. Chair, just to confirm with you that the budget was tabled, the 2020 budget was tabled in the context of a deteriorating economic environment, but also it was compounded by technical recessions in 2019. The technical recession occurs when there's no growth within the economy quarter on quarter. The second thing that happened is that we experienced 2 shocks which further created lots of economic, social difficulties for the country. The first was the sovereign downgrade. Now, what the sovereign downgrade creates, it creates an exponential effect on borrowing of funds, of monies in the domestic and international markets, but it also increases the interest rates repayment. So that's the shock that we've got. And then the shock that we're all experiencing, hence we becoming more efficient through these meetings, is the COVID impact that it had on social, economic, but also it created a huge health crisis for us. Today we're talking to you about the macroeconomic framework, the revenue and expenditure proposals in the 2020 budget, but also the government fiscal response to COVID. And we have some thoughts for you to consider on when you can engage on the budget, where reprioritization should happen as a result of COVID. I'm handing over to Shen to take you through, if you don't mind. Chair, also, can we just carry on in the way we carry on so that we don't waste time every time?
Okay, good morning, Honourable Chair and members. I'll also go right to the macroeconomic and fiscal policy outlook. Next slide, please. So South Africa, prior to the COVID-19, has already been facing quite a few challenges, specifically this tepid growth and constantly harassed by recessionary scares. So in terms of actual figures, we're looking at near zero growth in 2019, and by end of that, it, as our chairperson mentioned, it slipped into a technical recession, which means that there have been two consecutive negative growths, real growths in GDP. So and notwithstanding that, of course, is with the onset of the COVID-19, is that there is a high chance, if not actually certainty, that the COVID-19 will push the economy into a deep, deep recession and contraction of the economy this year. And also on the fiscal side, the recent sovereign credit downgrade, of course, has also added on to that pressure in terms of the cost of borrowing, making it more expensive for South Africa to borrow funds domestically and abroad, and all of that is putting a downward pressure on the growth trajectory of the South African economy. So in terms of all projections, on the top right slide, which we'll go into detail a little bit later, is that South Africa is likely to face all those very deep economic contraction because all the disruptions or the shock of COVID-19, stoppage of numerous limitations on the consumption, on the investments, and basically activities in the economy is disrupted. So next slide, please. In terms of this is just to show you that the two consecutive recession there. And next slide. Projection shows that for the first for this year, due to COVID-19, we're looking at a contraction varying from single digits to almost double digits in terms of that recession. Next slide. So fiscal matrix is saying that is indicating to us that the fiscal deficits, namely the revenue minus expenditure, has widened, meaning that there's the shortfall on the revenue side as well as a extraordinary increases on the expenditure side. So historically, and prior to COVID-19, since 1990s, there was already that widening gap between the revenue and expenditure, leading to deficits. And massive differences to budget deficit projections, as tabled in the budget documents over the last few years, has indicated not just the substantial deterioration, but actually this heightened volatility and uncertainty around the South African fiscal matrix. And that brings down our fiscal credibility and also, of course, our outlook in terms when we go to our rating agency friends when they assess our fiscal stability and sustainability looking forward. And another big measure is that government debt trajectory has critically worsened as a result of sustained that weakening in that growth, the tepid growth, deteriorating growth, and it is anticipated that government debt will increase to 869 billion over the medium term. And notwithstanding the level, it's also the trajectory of that debt increasing. Sean, going to the further projections for debt to GDP, it's safe to say that it's nuanced in terms of what determines those debt to GDP ratios. This slide just to quickly show that over the short time before this is that there have been projections, but it's far off, right, compared to what we now expect with the COVID-19 onset. Next slide, please. So with the pandemic, and this being a pandemic and the health shock, is that there is a need for that extraordinary health budget to respond to it. So it's a health crisis, as much as it is also an economic one and a financial one. And so the demand on the health sector becomes substantially more now, and specifically that we need to prepare for it. That there's the need to increase healthcare access, specifically effective ambulance systems, intensive care units with ventilators and drugs to maximize chances of survival until vaccine is developed. And then, of course, it's the construction, your infrastructure around hospitals and clinics, facilities, especially in high density areas of cities. Environmental and port health, that is basically controlling your flow of people and therefore the disease pattern from abroad. And most importantly, we need to protect our troops in terms of fighting the COVID-19 and providing them the personal protective gear. So in this context, we must continue prioritizing this health response with our budget. Next slide, please. As I'll hand over to Dr. Nkube to take over the response and revenue and so on. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. I'm going to go through to simply recap on the revenue and expenditure proposals which we presented after the February budget. There are three issues there which the Commission wishes to highlight.
Hello, Chairperson. Hello, Chair.
Members.
May you please? Hello, Chairperson. Chairperson, it's Lubabalo. May you please ask Dr. Ngube to activate his camera, Chair?
That's what I was trying to do.
Okay.
Members and the team, can you please switch on your cameras as you present? Because the meeting is live. Please.
Sorry, Lubabalo, my computer has some challenges on the camera, please.
Usually people who are saying they're experiencing problems, I'm not saying you are. I later find out that they are not dressed correctly, Honorable, Prof. They are just hiding behind the camera. But if possible, keep on trying, please. And IT can assist you. Continue presenting.
Chairperson, if I may. Dr. Ngube's computer, we've requested that he should be supplied with a new computer yesterday. It's been going on for a while, so he is telling nothing but the truth. All of the truth. I was supposed to. I was not
saying him. Thank you. You can continue, Dr. Ngube.
My apologies. Thank you.
Thank you.
My apologies, Chair. I'll continue. This slide simply recaps the revenue and expenditure proposals we presented in February, after the February budget. On this one, there are three issues the Commission wishes to note. First, it is that we have noted that on the revenue and expenditure proposal, there is a gradual shift from a purely social sector focus in the previous years to an economic development, community development, and social development focus in the next 3 years. So this is a welcome approach because it is really balancing economic growth as well as providing social safety net to the poor households. The second issue there is we want to note there is the rapid growth in debt service costs. As Prof. Blackis has mentioned in the introduction, that debt is increasing. The challenge there is the debt service cost, which it is now crowding out spending on all aspects of government delivery. So we also note that the debt service cost will exceed spending on health and community development. So that is a real concern. Then the third point we want to note there is that in the revenue and expenditure proposal presented in February, we see an attempt to rein in spending on personnel, which is a really commendable approach. But the Commission wishes not that when we are discussing when there is the debate on the public sector wage bill, this debate should be preceded by a robust determination of the size and shape of government that suits the South African context. So there is a need when we are looking at the wage bill issue that it must be contextualized within our own circumstances and the size and shape of government that we wish to see. Next slide. The next slide looks at the question which the honorable members asked, the COVID implications on the fiscal framework. The COVID, when it visited the country early in March, it hit the economy, which was already on a cyclical downward path. We've seen the technical recession by the close of 2019. So the economy was already on a cyclical downward path. But then after the COVID pandemic, we see that the fiscal framework tabled in February is no longer attainable. And due to economic shutdown in economic activities and general disruption in the economy. If we look at the table below there, it looks at some of the economic outcomes if we assume certain growth rates in the economy. We have seen before that the economy will contract by between 6 or 16%, and there are even some estimates which say it will contract by up to 20%. And looking at the table below, these are the implications of different levels of contractions, that if it is 6%, revenue shortfalls will amount to around 83 billion. But if it contracts by 16%, revenue shortfalls may even increase to 222 billion. So this is the depth of the crisis which the economy is facing. Next slide. The next slide looks at the implications of COVID in different sectors. Suffice to look at the last column there, whereby we are looking at the severe decline, which is larger than 60% in a number of sectors. Look at in the last column to our right there, some of these sectors are actually supporting the economy in terms of exports. So they will be severely affected by the COVID pandemic. And if they are affecting the export, it means foreign currency earnings will be affected. They need to have ripple effects on the entire economy. Next slide. On this particular slide, we look at government response, what the government has done as a result of COVID. It has introduced combined fiscal and monetary response packages. 500 billion, which we all know comprises of fiscal support, and additionally, we have a number of monetary and financial market interventions, which I'll mention in the next slide. looking at the fiscal support, really it is comparable to many developed countries, G20 countries. It is equivalent to about 10% of GDP and almost 18% when monetary reforms are taken into account. We see in the graph below or in the next slide showing where the country fares comparatively to relative to other countries. Next slide. Simply showing the same picture there that it is 10% of GDP and it compares favorable to many other countries. Next slide. Then we show a breakdown of the fiscal and monetary responses there. And health sector, about 20 billion in the form of interventions in that particular sector. Municipalities, another 20 billion. And that business non-guarantee schemes, another 200 billion. On the right-hand side, we have monetary response package, which includes interest rate reductions, credit extensions, as well as purchasing of bonds in the secondary market. Next slide. Next slide, yes. These are the funding sources for COVID fiscal response. And where is the money going to come from to fund the COVID response packages? So we see that only 95 billion of the total fiscal package, if we look at that table below, constitutes new injection into the economy, which is supposed to support business support and to provide business support and job protection. There is really no discernible baseline increase to the 1.95 trillion budget which was tabled in February, arising from the 500 billion, except that particular 95 billion. But in addition to that, we know that there are additional monetary and financial measures which have been put in place to support different activities in the context of COVID. So that's where this money is going to come from. I want to note there the budget reprioritization, which is 130 billion, which will be the focus of our last slides. Where will this 130 billion, which will be reprioritized from the budget, where will it come from? We shall dwell much on that one. Next slide. On this particular slide, the Commission makes an assessment of the fiscal and monetary response. Government's response. So first of all, the Commission commends the immediate response by the government to pushing business and households from the impact of the lockdown. However, it is important to note that the 95 billion in response could be considered only as a fiscal stimulus, which means to the Commission that this stimulus package falls far too short of the expected shock. If we look at the shock, the figures we have put across before that GDP growth will contract significantly by between 5 and 20%, depending on which estimates one focuses on. This is a great shock to the economy. And also job losses. We find some estimates are putting job losses at more than 1 million, that as a result of COVID, these are the job losses, more than 1 million, some even 1.5 million. So the size of the shock is very heavy, so that the 95 billion may not do justice to the size of the shock before us. And so these fiscal and monetary support measures should be commensurate with the magnitude of the shock we are forecasting. And FFC recommends 3 issues: that there is a need for government to deploy more resources into there's a need for government to be aggressive and do bond purchasing by the South African Reserve Bank. And this will substantially strengthen liquidity in markets. And secondly, government should consider its total balance sheet, assets from the PIC, Government Pension Fund, UIF, and South African Reserve Bank could be deployed. And also that both the fiscal and monetary response embrace distributional equity. There must be some distribution as the principles outlined in the Constitution, Section 214A to J, that emphasize that there must be some equity in the distribution of the resources which come from these monetary fiscal activities. Next slide. On the next slide, the Commission argues that there is a need for a broader reform agenda. There is a need for broad reform agenda to resuscitate the economy, especially even in the context of the COVID pandemic. In the view of the Commission, this particular reform agenda should encompass a number of areas. We have seen the National Treasury paper on economic transformation, inclusive growth and competitiveness. The Commission believes that this paper is in the right direction. It is pro-growth and it supports competitiveness and higher productivity. However, in implementing these reforms suggested by Treasury in the Treasury paper, we note that they are going to compete with other initiatives such as land expropriation without compensation, deepening the establishment of the National Health Insurance Scheme. So, in a nutshell, there is a need for prioritization and sequencing of these particular reforms. These reforms are essential. There is a need for prioritization and sequencing so that they are more effective. And also the Commission recommends that there is a need for breaking the cycle of inequality. And to do so, there is a need for broader structural reform, which are listed in the next two slides. Next slide, please. In this slide, we look at the structural reforms which the Commission is suggesting. The first one is improving the governance and fighting corruption. We know that state capture has weakened a number of state institutions and has weakened the capability of the state. So there's an urgent need to rebuild the institutional framework and institutional capacity. On the second one there's also a need for African competition. And opposing this, it means an entry into the market of SMMEs. So there's a need for incentives to encourage SMMEs to enter mainstream economy. The other reform area is on land reform, that it must be geared to food security, improve land tenure, improving land administration, and strengthen food security. And next slide, we look at three other reform areas. There is a need to reduce the cost of broadband and assignment of high demand spectrum. We note that a more cost-efficient network will foster technology adoption and innovation. It will enable a shift towards e-learning, e-health, and those particular activities are very, very efficient and they prepare the country for the fourth industrial revolution. There is also a need to strengthen state capacity. In terms of this, there is a need to sharpen coordination, to improve state machinery, to avoid duplication, and adopt new technologies to improve efficiencies. And lastly, there is a need to review the means tests across the board. We see that as a result of COVID, there are challenges with our means tests across the board. Many people have found themselves in abject poverty, incomes have been going down, unemployment has increased, and many people are indebted. So it means there's a need to review the means test or the eligibility criteria to access many forms of relief and grants to support either students, to support indigents in municipalities. Next slide. On the next slide, we go back to the question of the 130 billion. Where will this money be prioritized from? So this particular, the next slides are looking at where the money will come from, where will it be prioritized. We looked at a number of areas where the money will come from, and we based our analysis on a set of criteria, which is shown in the next slide, titled Basis for Reprioritization. So this particular slide simply lists the criteria we use in pinpointing the areas where the 130 billion is prioritized from. First of all, there's a need in reprioritizing to protect the basic rights of people, especially protect spending on basic services like water, sanitation, refuse removal. There's a need to protect such spending in reprioritizing. Secondly, there's a need to balance equity. There's a need to try and balance equity, balance rural versus urban, special equity, formal versus informal in reprioritizing. There's a need to be conscious on equity. Thirdly, we also looked at spending performance in different budget items. That if, for example, spending on a certain budget exhibits consistent underspending or irregular in wasteful expenditure, we need to look at the causes of that, and if there are no really founded causes, then it becomes a good candidate for reprioritization. So there's a need to look at the causes of that underspending, and if it is not justified, then reprioritizing becomes essential. Then we also looked at the impact. We were pinpointing to areas which we see that there will be the least impact on livelihoods and the economy. They have the least impact on people's livelihoods and the economy. And also we looked at high potential growth areas, looking at historical growth. If the growth has been exaggerated, was too high, then it means it is a good candidate for moderation in the context of COVID. And we tried to distinguish essential versus non-essential areas, whereby essential areas are those areas which provide direct response to COVID in the form of social relief, and also those areas which are assisting with the effects of COVID, fight against COVID, and lockdown regulations. If you look at the departments of police and defense, they assist in enforcing regulations. So those areas are essential, as well as areas or sectors which are essential to kickstart the economy, like transport, energy, and agriculture. Those become essential agriculture for food security. Then also the areas like the which we call new priority areas in the context of COVID, because we now live in a digital technology society. So areas like communication, digital technologies, that's SA for data, science and innovation, those are essential areas. Next slide. After using that set of principles or criteria, we look at the essential departments. These are listed in this particular slide on reprioritization by department. So those are some of the areas where the argument is that even if we are reprioritizing from these particular boards, it shouldn't be as aggressive as the areas which are not in this particular slide. Then the next slide, we look at potential areas for reprioritization. These are different areas where we can reprioritize, and we indicate the pockets of funding where reprioritization can be effected. We also look at spending on each particular area over the MTF, the total amounts of spending which would be allocated to these particular areas, and we are arguing that there is a possibility of reprioritizing from these particular line items. The first one, after noting before that we have essential services, compensation of employees by national departments, which will be allocated about almost 600 billion over the MTF. There's a need there to look closely into that. If it is non-essential, then there's a need for moderation. And we also look at goods and services spending by national departments, where over the MTF, 246 billion will be spent, and we disaggregate that into travel and subsistence, training and development, and catering. So we are saying that these are potential areas where looking at them closely, and if it is not essential, and if it is not fulfilling that criteria we listed above, then it is feasible that the reprioritization can occur away from some of these spending items. For example, travel and subsistence, if it is not linked to the fight on COVID, if it is not going to affect economic growth or influence economic growth, then there is room to reprioritize that. Training and development, if it is not essential, if it is not related to the fight against COVID, or if it is not going to influence economic growth, then it could either be deferred or reprioritized, deferred and ending be reprioritized for COVID. Catering services also the same story there. And we also look at infrastructure spent across government departments. We see that government departments are going to spend about 18 billion on new infrastructure over the MTF. Here one has to be very clear on reprioritizing on infrastructure. It should not be a blanket reprioritization because it can affect economic growth. We know that infrastructure investment is essential for economic growth. So reprioritizing infrastructure must be done cautiously after careful analysis of the infrastructure and the effects of that reprioritization on economic growth. So on new infrastructure, we are saying that if it is not essential for kickstarting the economy or the fight against COVID, and it can be reprioritized, especially if it is at that pre-feasibility stage or procurement stage, it can easily be reprioritized if it is not going to have adverse effects on the economy. Similarly, on existing infrastructure, if it is not really essential for the fight against COVID, if it is not going to create backlogs, unnecessary backlogs in the economy, and if it is not necessary for long-term economic growth, then there is need to look at it closely. There may be some room for reprioritizing there. But the most important thing there on infrastructure is that it should not be a blanket reprioritization. It should be looked into carefully, and careful analysis must be done, as well as if it compensation of employees, it must be looked at carefully because now we have frontline staff in which are involved in the fight against COVID. So it should not affect us negatively. Then we also looked at conditional grants across provinces and municipalities, and also there are possibilities there for reprioritizing. And the next slide simply emphasizes the point on infrastructure that it must be looked at carefully. Careful analysis, it should not be a blanket approach, and only infrastructure that is not essential in the fight against COVID, not essential in the resuscitation of the economy, and that infrastructure which will not create unnecessary backlogs, then it must be looked at and some room for reprioritization can be found there. Then next slide, simply list a number of grants which go to the provinces and municipalities managed by from national departments, which we think there is room to reprioritize from. We look at a number of, there are about 24 grants there, which we have identified that there is, if looked closely, there is room to reprioritize. For example, I'll take the first one there, sports, art and culture. The grants there, one of them is for community library services. Then it is for upgrading new libraries or investing in new infrastructure, which means investing in new libraries or upgrading existing libraries. So on that one, because we have a crisis now at hand, then there is a room to defer some of those investments to the future and reprioritize some of the funds to the fight against COVID. So we looked at that, and looking at the narrative, we have listed all these grants and arguments why we think there's a need to reprioritize from each of them, and looking at, based on our criteria we have proposed on the onset, as well as looking at its effects on the economy and also its impact on livelihoods. Then we'll suggest some reprioritization. So this is the list of programs which we reprioritize, but looking at the impact as I have mentioned before. Then the next slide looks at other opportunities for cost saving or efficiencies. Besides reprioritizing from grants, from national boards, we looked at other areas where we can make savings so that we can get some money to fight the pandemic. So on this one, we need to do things differently, more efficiently, get some savings. There is room to be more efficient and effective in terms of government spending across the board, provinces and municipalities. There are high incidences of wasteful, irregular and unauthorized expenditure. The AG has pointed this numerous times, so that remains a big challenge, and especially within municipalities, and that must be eradicated, and savings can be made if we spend efficiently and there's value for money every time. So that's the first point. Then also we see that one of the COVID legacies, or what COVID has done, it has spurred the adoption of new technologies as we are doing now. We are becoming more efficient. We have seen new business models, and if this continues, we shall realize more savings and improve on our output. And lastly, there is a need to reorganize through restructuring programs, improving coordination, and improving and sharpening state machinery, and also looking at irregularities, fraud, and corruption, and being decisive on this. This will make the state efficient and realize more savings and more resources to fight against the pandemic. And with that, I hand over to Professor Patrick.
So Chairperson, very quickly, that we're saying then that there's a need for government to expand its spending on social relief, but also to fund growth-inducing activities. We have the view that we're probably going to get into a situation where there's going to be a need to look at income support and other forms of assets to households, given the situation that we find ourselves in. The second is that we think that the pandemic and the environment that we find ourselves in, either within the public sector or in the private sector, gives the executive branch a great opportunity to speed up the reorganization of the state, as pronounced by the President in one of his State of the Nation addresses. And through that reorganization, we think that we'll be able to see some of the efficiencies within the state, but also possibly certain programs that is not performing, some of those programs to be cut, and that we can get to mobilize greater resources. The digital economy is a big issue that's currently showing us that we can actually gain lots of efficiencies. The downside of it is that we need to ask government then to rethink and relook at the cost of data, so that we don't leave people behind. Because as we move into the conversations of the industrial revolution, the IRA 5 and IRA 4, we have the potential to leave, especially when it comes to the artificial intelligence, to leave masses of people behind. So there's a need to look at the data costs around that. The third aspect is the reprioritization. We think that in response to COVID, there's clearly going to be a need to shift greater funds to health and healthcare provision, but also to expand safety nets and social protection. We have the view that the fiscal and monetary package measures that gets distributed, but there's a need to look at equitable distribution of that, in particular between the different levels of government, between provinces, but also between municipalities. And we've obviously noticed that rural local municipalities are actually suffering because of the lack of economic activities that's in their own area. In fact, some of the local municipalities are economically and fiscally unviable. So there's a need to rethink also that reorganization at the municipal level. And clearly the district approach provides a great opportunity for the state. We also welcome the shift that has happened over time to a greater emphasis on economic development, community development, and social development. We think that there's a need to prioritize public expenditure spending, public infrastructure spending rather, and to think about how do we deal with those programs that's not yet taken off, where there's still a pre-feasibility study and it's still at the procurement stage, and look at the urgency of those programs relative to the great need of resources that needs to go to the other new priorities that we've picked up. We also have indicated to you that expenditure on goods and services that are not critical for service delivery or the fight against COVID needs to be reprioritized, especially around training and development. There's a need to look at that and to look at new platforms. And clearly, we're moving into a space where UNISA can teach us a lot on that. And that's why you hear sometimes people talk about the University of UNISA that's going on around many other universities that need to learn lessons from there. We've indicated to you 24 conditional grants, which we think needs to be relooked at. And hopefully when the Treasury comes back, it will give you some ideas as to after the 24th of June as to which ones has been considered, because we also shared our presentation and our documents with the Treasury officials. On that, Chairperson, thank you very much for your time, and we await any comments and questions from you.
Thank you, Prof. Am I audible enough, honorable members?
Yes, we can hear you, Chairperson.
Thank you so much, Honorable Ryder. Honorable members, I've made a request that we allow Parliamentary Budget Office to make a presentation, because their presentation, they really overlap each other, and also so that we can be able to manage time and not spend much time on one presentation and going to attend to the other presentation. So if we club them together, we will be able to give members enough time to engage with the presentations. And I hope there is that understanding. Can I get a confirmation? Honorable Karim, are you there? Is it fine?
It's fine, Comrade Chair Jadu.
Oh, thank you and welcome, Honorable Njadu.
Chairperson, I'm very much, as you know, it seems fine to me.
Thank you so much. Okamp, I think you won't have, I know you won't have a problem, and so is Titoit and Ryder and Muletsani. Thank you so much, honorable members. PBO, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, honorable members, honorable Chair. I'm going to load up our presentation now. Thank you. May I proceed, Chair?
Yes, you can proceed, and if possible, please, if your slides are numbered, just to help members indicate on which slide are you, if they are numbered.
Okay.
Thank you. Continue. Is there a problem?
Sorry, I've tried putting up my presentation, but it's not sharing. Is it possible for Lubabalo or somebody else to put up the presentation, and we will tell him when to change slides?
No problem. I can assist you, Doc.
Thank you very much.
Okay, while he does that, he's doing that, Doctor, can you, oh, okay, it's fine. It's loaded now.
Thank you very much. If you can move to the first slide. Thanks. I'm not going to run through everything we're doing.
Babalo?
Yes.
Number 2.
Thank you, Honorable Chair. We're going to be providing a background of the development of the 2020 appropriations, changes of the economic outlook since the tabling of the 2020 budget, impact of COVID-19 on the economy and the budget, an overview of public expenditure, structure of the 2020 appropriations, unforeseen and unavoidable expenditure, disaster relief funds and programs available to respond to the pandemic, and then authorization required for reprioritization, changes to conditions and outputs, preliminary provisions and possibilities for reprioritization within the 2021 allocations, and then conclude. Next slide, please. I won't go through all of this because I think the Honorable Chair actually outlined a lot of what we were saying in this first slide. So next slide, please. The background to the development of the 2020 Appropriations Bill. The 2020 budget proposed a significant reduction in growth of expenditure to reduce the budget deficit and the level of debt. Lower debt requires targeted spending cuts of specific programs. The steps proposed in the 2020 budget included reduction of the public wage bill, reform of state-owned companies and the road accident fund, across-the-board cuts that affect core government programs. These steps will moderate spending as a share of GDP and adjust the composition of expenditure, but will not reduce the debt level.
Can
Further
we all
expenditure.
switch off our videos and mics so that we can assist in terms of the linkage for Prof?
Is the audio fine, Honourable Chair?
Perfect.
Thank you. Further expenditure cuts could severely harm service delivery. Critical factors include efficiency and effectiveness, together with monitoring and evaluation, discussions on increased taxes in the current economic environment. Next slide. Thank you. So changes to the economic outlook since the tabling of the 2020 budget. This is overlap with what our colleagues at FFC presented, but what we show is that in the 2020 National Treasury Budget Review, it was put at growth was put at 0.9%. Sorry, Chair. The International Monetary Fund saw South Africa's growth dropping in April 2020 to minus 0.7. The Reserve Bank in May gave a forecast of minus 5.8. The BER gave a forecast of minus 9.5. Rand Merchant Bank of minus 12%. I saw in the business day this morning, the World Bank has come with an updated forecast of minus 8% for South Africa. And we see in 2021 forecast recoveries of 3.8% by IMF and the Reserve Bank of 4%. And I would like members to note that this increase is after the decline of, for instance, for the Reserve Bank of minus 5.8%. And so the economy will still be behind by almost 2%, even after the recovery of 4% in 2021. So South Africa was already on a slow growth path with rising socioeconomic demands, record high unemployment, and concerns over sustainability of national debt. COVID-19 and policy responses to reduce and contain the spread will push the world and SA economy into a deep, prolonged recession. Forecasts during a recession are especially uncertain and varied. SA will almost certainly experience a recession with large losses to income and employment. Next slide, please. The broad impact on the South African economy, the channels by which the national lockdown and efforts to contain the spread of COVID-19 impact on economic activity, a forced reduction in production and other restrictions on non-essential business operations, a large but indeterminate reduction in household demands for goods, especially services like travel and movement restrictions affect tourism and related activities, the disruption in global production and supply chains, which could greatly affect South African exports. The effect of uncertainty on business investment, and as businesses open, employers and workers fear growing infections and further disruptions. Next slide, thank you. We've got this data and graphs from the Stats South Africa, the results from the second wave survey on the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on employment and income in South Africa. Now, these it refers to the first 6 weeks of the lockdown, beginning on the 26th of March 2020 to the 6th of May 2020. You see that if you look at the graph on the left, the salaries and wages decreased from 76.6 to 66.7. This is the change in the income source. And not to go through all the others, but to go right to the bottom, the last bars, we see that the number of households without income grew from 5.2% to 15.4%. So we see already a large impact on households from this first wave of this period in lockdown, based on the second wave results from Stats South Africa. We see in weekly spending behavior that almost 36% of households say they're spending more, and I think a lot of households have been trying to stock up in case there are going to be shortages. We see about 20% saying they're spending the same, but we've got almost 39% saying they're spending less. Thank you. Next slide, please. Now, this is in graphical form, similar to what FFC presented. What we do is the PBO's estimates, and our we took the median of growth outlook forecasts as we usually do to estimate growth. This doesn't include the latest figure from the World Bank, but it includes the others we presented earlier. And we see the red line in the top graph is what was in the 2020 budget review, the National Treasury's estimates of the budget balance as a percentage of GDP. And we're seeing that in this 2021 year declining to more than negative 15%, and then slowly improving to probably close to 10%. Looks like 8.5 or 9% by 2022-23. Again, these are very estimates that are very uncertain, as I think everybody's been pointing out. And so these numbers will be probably updated in the next week or even sooner. Not updated with the reality changes so much. In terms of our gross debt as a percentage of GDP, we're seeing the National Treasury's figures in red and PBO's projections, our estimates in green, and that those will be growing quite fast in 2021 and continue to be higher than the estimates in the budget review in 22, and in 2022-23 it will be slightly less than what was estimated, so slowly coming down as the budget balance improves. So the data for April shows a 9.1% fall in gross revenue collected compared with the previous year. This trend is likely to worsen over the rest of this year. Revisions to the budget are necessary to take account of the changed outlook and finance measures to respond to the crisis and stimulate the economy. Next slide, please. So in the next few slides, we're going to be looking at the period of fiscal consolidation, and the idea here is to give members a sense of what's been happening to especially social expenditure on services during the period since 2012-2013, the period of fiscal consolidation, and a few of us points focus on what's happened since 2016-17, and so this slide refers to the graphs in the next three slides. First, we see that real government expenditure per capita has been slow during the fiscal consolidation era. It was slower in each of the years 2016-17. There's actually a typo in this presentation that I corrected in my presentation, but since I can't show it to you, it's still incorrect here. It was meant to say 2017-18 and 2018-19, and not 2019-20. So it was in those 3 years, it was lower than in each year than in 2015-16. So we actually see that government expenditure per capita, real government expenditure, was lower. And it's important that we take into account real expenditure, because often the figures are presented in nominal terms and the impact on inflation is not taken into account. These numbers use the GDP deflator to come up with real numbers, not PPI, not CPI, sorry. Also, we do it per capita to get a sense, because the population is growing, to get a sense of how expenditure is changing on the population. We also find that there was a significant reduction in real per capita expenditure on housing and community amenities. Real per capita expenditure on health and education was very slow, and social protection expenditure was flat until there was a slightly bigger increase in 2019-20. And then referring to the graph on the right here, we say in 2019-20, most of the increase in expenditure from 2019-20 to 2021 was to assist ESCOM. And you see that the little text box within the graph says that about 95% of the 706 Rand per capita, real per capita increase in government expenditure in economic affairs was for fuel and energy. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to talk through all these slides, just that this slide was what was referred to in the first point. And if you look at 2015-16 and compare the 3 years after that, we see that decline we mentioned. Next slide, please. And we see here the decline in housing and community amenities, and this is important given the space issues and also other access to basic services and things that the supports that and the impact that the pandemic has on households and the spread and the reductions that we had before has been a liability or not supported the resilience of communities in the face of that. Next slide, please. And again, spending on health has been fairly flat. Education and social protection clusters we see. We do see on education that increase from 2017-18, and I think some of that is related to the NSFAS and the move to providing more people with free access to education. But what's worrying was the trends in health and social protection. Next slide, please. So, Chair, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Nilo Landi, to continue with this. I'm going to put myself on mute and cut my video. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Morning, honourable members. I will continue now from slide 13 onwards. And slide 13 is just providing some context to the development of the 2020 budget, showing the expenditure outcomes of the previous 3 years. Departments that spend it below 85% were communication, corporate governance and traditional affairs and national treasury. This amounted to 9% over the 3-year period, and departments with below 65% expenditure on capital assets were international relations and corporate services and national treasury, higher education and training, social development, economic development, energy, telecommunications and postal services, and arts and culture. These expenditure trends were also considered by the National Treasury when budget reductions in the growth of expenditure were proposed in the 2020 budget. The slide shows the baseline reduction of 66 billion, of which program baseline reductions were just more than 28 billion, and wage bill reductions almost 38 billion. Reallocations include financial support to state-owned companies of more than 44 billion. Next slide. The committee asked the PBO, amongst others, to identify funding possibilities within votes for reprioritization. One method of showing this is to analyze past and current expenditure trends. This slide is one appropriations of a selection of votes in terms of the size of their budgets. So when we look at the bottom line, the bottom row indicates that preliminary outcomes for the 2019 budget was more than 100%. The spending on the 2019 budget was 941 billion, and then this budget increases in 2020 by 2.3% to 963 billion. When we look at corporate governance, for example, preliminary spending for 2019-20 amounts to 95.9%. In such instances of low expenditure, the department can either request for rollovers of underspending of funds or surrender the funds to the National Revenue Fund. When we also look at corporate governance, in 2020, that budget, despite the low spending in the 2019-20, increased by 6.5% to 96 billion. The same argument is also valid for vote 41, water and sanitation. On the other hand, we have social development. The preliminary outcomes for 2019-20 shows an over-expenditure of almost 8%. In such instances, the overspending amount will be first charged to the 2020 appropriation. When you look at the last column, the budget for 2020 on social development increased by 7% to 197, almost 198 billion. Next slide. So the next slide just summarizes the proportion of budget appropriated by economic classification. To note is the high proportion of 68.9% that the budget spend on transfers and subsidies. We spend 10.6% on compensation of employees of the total appropriation. So just having said this, when we exclude transfers and subsidies from the entire appropriations bill, the expenditure on compensation of employees actually increases by 37.9% on a national level. Next slide. So in several budget discussions, members wanted to know how government spent the money. So the next two slides are demonstrating the structure of the budgets of a few departments. The first example is Public Works and Infrastructure with a budget of 8%. In terms of the structure, this department spent 87 on transfers, of which 4.4 billion is allocated towards the property management entity, and we spent 2.4 billion on the expanded public works program. In terms of the current expenditure of 13% of the total budget, it's almost 600 million. What this actually means is that public works spent almost 600 million on COE to monitor transfers of almost 7 billion. Goods and services, the department spent 460 million. On the right-hand side, we've got a much larger budget in cooperative governance of 96 billion. This department transfers 94.8% of their budget, of which 81.8% is allocated towards the local government equitable share. The rest of the transfers are appropriated towards conditional grants and other. Current expenditure, the COE budget amounts to 395 million, and the goods and services budget amounts to 4.6 billion. In terms of the this department also allocates the community works program under goods and services. In the goods and services budget, the main expenditure items are consultants and for contractors, in specific for the community works program. Next slide. The next slide is an example of agriculture, land reform and rural development with a budget of 16.8 billion. This department transfers 50% or 8.4 billion rand, and this is towards conditional grants of 2.2 billion. These grants include the Ilima Letsema projects grant, the land care program, and the comprehensive agricultural support grant. And then these grants are also then transferred to the 9 provincial governments. The other transfers include Agricultural Research Council, Agricultural Land Holding Account, Land Reform Grants, and Restitution Grants. And then we also transfer to the Land Bank, 4.8% of the 6.3 billion. To note, the current expenditure in the compensation of employees budget is quite high. It's 4.4 billion. So what this means is that 4.4 billion is spent on compensation of employees, basically to monitor. The goods and services budget amounts to 3.6 billion, of which the main items are consultants, contractors, property payments, and travel and subsistence. Next slide. Another request from the committee was for us to comment on the influence of the COVID-19 pandemic on public finances. One thing is clear in terms of the coronavirus is that it exposed the deep underlying problems such as inequality, failure to deliver key services, and a failing health system, which requires government to act immediately with funds provided for disasters, and secondly, to prioritize plans and budgets to provide for fiscal sensitive measures, policing, new programs with new objectives and outputs, and recovery plans for fiscal sustainability and economic growth. Next slide. Next, the 2021 budget, which includes funding of 138 million for provincial disaster relief grants, 200 housing grant, 354 million was allocated towards the next. So in terms of programs that are available in the 2020-21 budget, in corporate governance, we have the National Disaster Management Centre program, communicable and non-communicable diseases program. In social development, we have the Social Assistance Program and the Welfare Services Policy and Implementation Support Program. In defense, we also have the Military Health Support Program. In police, visible policing. In housing, informal sector. And innovation has got a program for technology innovation. In terms of trade and industry and competition, we have the Industrial Financing Program, and water and sanitation has got a program for water infrastructure development. The next 4 slides cover some of the changes that were suggested by the National Treasury to the conditions of the conditional grants that will allow for expenditure in the current budget to address the specific needs of COVID-19. This includes changes to the school infrastructure backlog grant to provide for the trucking of water to full tanks, and also changes to the education infrastructure grant and to draw and equip boreholes. We can skip the slides 23 and 24, and we can continue with slide 25. Another change proposed in the community outreach grant. The Department of Health already created a new COVID-19 component for health, and they also reallocated 452 million to this component. To note is that the Department of Health has already also identified specific outputs for this allocation, and this is very useful and should actually also be compulsory for all the other changes that that government proposed, especially for oversight and monitoring purposes. Next slide. Preliminary financial provisions to address the COVID-19 pandemic pressures includes a 500 billion fiscal support package that combines revenue and spending measures, as well as loan guarantees, of which 200 billion is for a credit guarantee scheme, 100 billion for job creation, 70 billion is for measures, billion is to be reprioritized, of which 50 billion is recommended to support the vulnerable in terms of social grants, 40 billion for wage protection, 20 billion to health and other frontline services, and 20 billion to municipalities. And 50 billion is already available in the 2021 budget towards social grants. These provisions will be legalized through the introduction of a special adjustments budget. The 2019-20 Appropriations Act already provides for the approval of expenditure before the introduction of an Adjustments Appropriations Bill. This includes the approval of expenditure for unforeseen and unavoidable. What was already approved in the appropriations for the 2019 financial year and will be proposed to be rolled over to the 2020 financial year in order to finalize expenditure that could not take place in the 2019 financial year. So basically what it means, if there is the underspending in the 2019-20 financial year, government can already provide approval for this underspending to be spent in the 2020-21 financial year. The expenditure approved in terms of the Section 1 above must, however, be disclosed in the National Treasury's next quarterly report to the relevant parliamentary committees for oversight purposes. Next slide. So in terms of the legal framework provided by the 2019 Appropriations Act, National Treasury has granted approval that funds transferred to municipalities can be reallocated to be used to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. This includes a 2.4 billion in the Urban Settlement Development Grant, 1.5 billion in the Municipal Infrastructure Grant, 900 billion in the Public Transport Network Grant. Next slide. The approval was also provided for 306 million in the Indirect Regional Bulk Infrastructure Grant and 151 million from the Municipal Disaster Relief Grant has been approved as well to support non-metropolitan municipalities with the cost of sanitation and increased provision of other municipal services. Details of further support to the municipalities in the 2021 financial year will be announced when the Minister of Finance tables the special appropriation adjustments budget to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic that was announced by the President. Next slide. The committee also asked us to identify possible savings in votes that can be reprioritized towards the needs of the COVID-19 pandemic. It is, however, very early in the financial year to determine spending trends, but we've included this table to show the expenditure in the first month of the financial year. So when we look at the bottom row, on average, expenditure on current payments at this stage is at 6.7% in April. Spending on transfers and subsidies amounts to 7%, and payment for capital assets amounts to 2.1% of the 2020 budget. And in total, departments has spent 6.6% of the total budgets in the first month of the financial year. On this slide, we just give an example of the context of a typical goods and services budget. Members always ask the question of where can we reprioritize funds within goods and services. So this is just a typical example of goods and services, the items in the goods and services budgets. You can see departments spend funds on administration fees, advertising, auditing, catering. In this specific department, a very high percentage is spent on consultants and contractors and on inventory and other items such as consumables, stationery, operating leases, travel and subsistence, training and development, and venues and facilities. So one can only speculate on how the structure of this goods and services budget will change due to the lockdown and the working from home arrangement. Expenditure on these items are not available at this stage. The last slide shows the adjustments made to the 2019-20 budget in 2019, and we just want to try and identify whether these adjustments are relevant for the 2020 adjustments budgets that the National Treasury will table. When we look at the bottom section of this table, you will see that in 2019 provisions were made of 10 million. This year provisions are made for allocations not assigned to votes of 7 billion. So this 7 billion will now be appropriate in the adjusted budget. Infrastructure funds were allocated in 2019 of 1 billion. In this budget, we don't have that allocation. Provisional allocation for ESCOM of the 23 billion will be allocated in the new budget. In the previous budget, it was 5 billion. And then last year, we had a contingency reserve of 13 billion, which has been reduced to 5 billion, that will be appropriated in the adjustments appropriation. So just to conclude, members, the 2020 budget proposes expenditure reductions based on the economic and fiscal pressures on government. The COVID-19 pandemic has put additional pressures on the government, not only to respond to the needs of the crisis, but also to ensure economic and fiscal sustainability. Although current programs on conditional funding to other spheres of government are available for immediate response, reprioritization, additional funding, and criteria for spending are required. Legislation provides for the implementation of such measures as well as for the regular reporting and monitoring through the oversight process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, PBO. Thank you for the presentation. I will now request Estelle to help me with noting the members who wants to engage with the two presentations. So far, I have two hands. I have Honorable Ryder and Honorable Muletsani in that order, while others are still trying to log in. Honorable Ryder.
Thank you, Chairperson. Sorry, I think my camera is still turning on. Give it a minute or so. It's got to warm up on this cold morning. Thank you. As you said, the two presentations have a good overlap, and I think that I will direct the majority of my questions to the FFC because they've taken a slightly different approach to the PBO. No disrespect to the PBO, I think it's difficult to navigate our way through what we're doing now because, as the chairperson said, this budget is going to change almost immediately. So, having said that, we still need to give it a fair chance. And chairperson, you got on top of me right at the beginning of the meeting. We must never forget that this document tells us that the NCOP has got a specific role to play. So there's no way we can be a rubber stamp for the National Assembly. Section 68 of the document tells us exactly what we need to do in terms of legislation, be it 75, 76 or 77 bills. We will give it all good consideration. Chairperson, I will try and be quick and with due respect to the 3 minutes, although it looks like we may have a few extra minutes today. So PBO, FF, thank you very much for a good presentation as always. I would like to comment first of all on slide 4, although it's actually slide 6. I see the information was duplicated in slide 6, where Treasury's I beg your pardon. The South African Reserve Bank. The South African Reserve Bank appears to be lagging in terms of their projections for GDP growth, and Treasury seems to have taken a much bigger step of a contraction of 16.1%. It's quite a big variance. If we can just perhaps have an indication as to what is realistic in terms of that from the FFC's point of view. Then I want to go to slide 9. Slide 9 spoke about the pandemic and the health shock. Gee, I hope you can still hear me because my screen has gone blank.
Sorry.
Okay. Chairperson, so the original projections for COVID-19 in South Africa were along the lines of 300,000 deaths. The Health Department has revised those projections down to around 40,000 deaths, with some experts even revising it further down to 10,000 deaths in South Africa over the next over the medium term. So my question is the response to the health shock as extreme as we thought it was 3 months ago? So where we were in March when we went into the first lockdown, I think we were all cautious, and based on the information we had then, it certainly appeared that the extreme health response was necessary. Considering the latest figures, is that health response still as necessary, or do we need to realign ourselves more closely to an economic stimulus to make sure that the economy gets the shot in the arm that it's needed? So what I'm doing there is essentially just questioning the issue around the health shock and whether that should be our biggest focus. So slide 11, I think, bullet number 4, in terms of revenue. Now, revenue, of course, is a massively important side of things, and we've seen SARS already stating that their revenue collection has shown a massive downturn. Considering that companies have been closed, there's not going to be profits made, there's going to be less taxes paid by companies. People are becoming unemployed, so there's not going to be people paying tax in their private capacities either. Revenue's under massive pressure. And I think that, yes, the debate on the public sector wage bill is going to continue raging. You've noted that in bullet 4. I think that COSATU's approach to this has not been very pliant or pliable, but they have indicated they'll come to the party to negotiate going forward. But certainly I think in the current financial year, we're facing massive problems. Then I wanted to just point out slide 14. Quite scary. You worked through it quite quickly, but I think what's important to note there is that the backbone of the economy is in the last 2 columns. So we've seen large declines in mining, quarrying, manufacturing, and of course agriculture as well, although we're not seeing that immediately. It will come through in due course because of the cyclical and the seasonal nature of that. So I think having agriculture in the first column, I think, is perhaps a short-term view. Maybe a comment on that would be nice. Then on slide 18, we spoke about the funding sources. 130 billion reprioritization. Personally, I think that I would have liked to see a bigger comment here on the fact that 130 billion rand prioritized is only a drop in the ocean because of the fact of the revenue impact that we're going to be seeing. So there's going to need to be not just 130 billion that's reprioritized out of the existing budget. We're also going to have to scale down the budget based on the much lower revenue collection projections that we're getting, and the fact that we're going to have to need not only to use the 130 billion that's going into the stimulus package, but we're also going to need to tighten the belt to make sure that we make up for the reduced revenue, because we can't afford to go out and borrow more money. Certainly with the downgrade. Chairperson, I note you're looking at your clock. I'm more than halfway through. Slide 21, food security. I think that there needs to be a lot more emphasis placed on food security going forward. Certainly with the unemployment and the burden on the state that we spoke about, I think food security is going to become massively important. The fact is that if we do not incentivize our farmers and make farming a little bit easier in this country, we're going to end up with a situation where we need to import more food. The point is that as soon as you're importing food, that is passing the costs onto the consumer. So where government can bear some of those costs by incentivizing farmers and by facilitating farmers, perhaps getting those emerging farmers the support that they've been asking for in our many, many meetings. So tying in the land redistribution together with some training and assistance going forward to ensure that our food security is nailed down. Not only that, we need to support our existing farmers, our proven commercial farmers, and make sure that it is cheap for them to farm so that the food prices go down. Because as soon as we're importing food, that cost gets put onto the consumers by the retailers that are doing the importing. So food security, massively important. Slide 24 needed a lot of emphasis, the basis for reprioritization. And what I wanted to say there is that following, the last 10 years we always talk about, okay, we're in serious trouble. We have this massive budget deficit. We have this massive growing debt, okay, and we were already in survival mode. The fact is that what you've got there is you've got a couple of really nice approaches, rights-based approach, equity, etc., which all have to inform these things. But the reality is that the basis is essential versus non-essential. We have to look at survival and what is absolutely essential. And again, we haven't addressed the revenue shortfall that we've got there. Slide 29, I wanted to just touch on there. Chairperson, you were struggling with your connectivity. This is as a direct result of the fact that we haven't released bandwidth into the technology companies around the country. We've been talking about it for years and years. Okay, I think it's 10 years, maybe we're going up to 11 years now, about releasing bandwidth. A good way of producing income for government. Okay, the auction will bring in a lot of income, but it would have made our lives so much easier if we had sufficient bandwidth and this economy was enabled to embrace the new technology. And yeah, the Prof spoke about the cost of data and the effect that this release of bandwidth is going to have on that. So yeah, I'm going to leave it at there. Just a request to the PBO. Dr. Siraj, you spoke about that one slide where you had corrected the slide. Please can you send it to us? It was a massively important slide that I'm going to share with some members on other committees. So having that correct slide will be quite important to us. Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for the presentations.
Thank you, Honorable Ryder. Honorable Mletsani, you are next.
Thank you, Chairperson. Let me start by welcoming the two presentations. My questions are to PBO. On the presentations, they talked about the budget reductions and expenditure. Now, I just want to check with them whether are there any mechanisms in place to make sure that such budget cuts they are not going to have any impact on service delivery. Secondly, as PBO, what is your recommendations to the 2020 Appropriation Bill to ensure that the proposed allocations provide meaningful response? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honorable Mletsani. Honorable Karim, you're next.
Thank you, Chairperson. Obviously, we're meant to focus on the appropriations that flowed from the February 2020 budget, right?
But inevitably and understandably, we spilled over into looking at what the issues are for the supplementary appropriations to come on June 24th. I just wanted to ask both institutions, both organizations, obviously the recovery of the South African economy depends in part on the global circumstances and recovery globally. Although in the new COVID circumstances, the situation might be somewhat different as countries retreat to their insularity and their borders and whatever, because their primary concern seems to be focusing on their own national economies. So, what is the other of these organizations, or what's the projections? Nobody can be exactly correct about, recovery globally. I saw this morning the OECD is saying that the world economy will contract by 12%. I'm just trying to get a sense also, in preparation for the supplementary budget, how we going to fare, no one has precise figures, but, sort of modeling and some sort of speculation, against other middle income countries, their recoveries. Ours, people say, will be fall of between 5 and 12%, and some say even more, even as much as 20%. So, what about other similar middle income developing countries? The second issue is obviously one hopes Mr. Ryder is right, that the number of deaths and infections will be far fewer in this country than originally projected. I don't know where the figure of 10,000 comes from, but if that's true, or if that works out to be true, it's great. But, I saw also yesterday, Comrade Chair, this highly globally regarded expert, he's the key advisor to the US, Dr. Fauci, I think. I don't know how to say his name. It's F-A-U-C-I. And the headline was, in one of the online newspapers, that he says he's horrified with all his experience, right? He dealt with the earlier SARS, and how pervasive it is. He described this as normally a good virus, so to speak, good in the negative sense, would take 6 months to travel. This one traveled within 1 month, I recall him saying. So, he's saying it's here to stay, and so on. So we don't really know how many people are going to die. But even if 5 people died of COVID-19, that's bad enough. So I don't think we should, as a committee, agree to the view that, not that I'm saying Mr. Ryder is saying explicitly, that we should over-focus on the economy at the expense of lives. We've said this before, you can't polarize them. In any case, if you have a dead workforce, so to speak, how is the economy going to function? So we can find an interrelationship, a balanced relationship between the two. And I think in any case, even if 5 more people were to die, it still doesn't detract from the need to focus on the health sector. We can't have a crisis like this, Comrade Chair, colleagues, and then not revamp the entire health sector and move steadily but progressively and consistently towards a national health insurance system. On that, there should be no relenting, really. I know it's a Herculean task, given where the public sector hospitals are. I was not naive about it. I know that we're going to alienate private sector doctors, but ultimately, we have no choice, Comrade Chair. So I don't think we should spend 1 inch on the need to use this now, as if we've not needed it before COVID-19, to get national health insurance going. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Honorable Karim. I had only 3 hands so far. I haven't received any.
My hand is up, Chair.
Your hand is up.
I also tried to put up my hand.
No. Whip, you lock in. You don't scream.
Trying, yeah, I can't get.
I'm going to recognize Honorable Kiva and Honorable Njandu. And for the last time, members, please use the chat icon if you can't raise your hand through other platforms, just to indicate that you have an interest. Write your name there. Honorable Mkiva.
Honorable Tutoi's hand is up also, Chair.
Okay, he'll come after Honorable Njandu. Honorable
Thank you very much.
Welcome. Okay. You can go on, Honorable Mkiva.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chairperson, for the privilege you are giving me to make an input. And I am sorry that my gadget does not show this icon of raising the hand. So I elected to send you directly a message on your WhatsApp, purely because I couldn't get that function right this side. Let me also join the colleagues for welcoming the presentations by the two organs of state. Chairperson, I would like to raise the following thing, which I see that the two organs are basically continuing on the same trajectory, also in terms of the recommendations that they are making. There is nothing that really talks to the current challenge as well as the advent of this current situation in terms of the economy. What I see is that it's the recommendations that they are making are more like a piecemeal fashion, in the sense that they say reduce there, take from there, and put on the other side. And I want to check the sustainability of that approach. Is it something that is really sustainable if that is going to be the approach that we are going to employ? And I also want to put it to them in this way. Are you being objective, or are you telling us as Parliament as well as government what we want to hear? Can you be a little bit objective in terms of saying that, for instance, the state is playing a much more central role, given the fact that the economy is performing at a very, very low level? And therefore, this suggests, for instance, that there is a collapse of the free market system, which means then that the state needs to be really at the center of ensuring that the economy works and works better for the citizens. That's number one. Number two is that on the issue of the new infrastructure, I would like you to sort of give a little bit of detail there, because I would be worried if you will say that just freeze an infrastructure that is not necessary. New infrastructure is always necessary, and I'll speak from a point of view of where I come from, because, you know, we are predominantly a rural country, and there's a great need for infrastructure in rural communities. And I think that need is going to be more, given the fact that there might need to be a change in terms of how we approach issues insofar as the economy is concerned. For instance, we want to say to our communities, they must go back to the fields and tilt the land and cultivate and plant and ensure that, because that is what is going to be create food security for us. The issue of cash, we may run out of cash anytime soon. And I've not heard you saying anything, for instance, in that regard. So I would like to hear from you, insofar as that new infrastructure is concerned, to sort of give a little bit of detail of what you mean by saying that you may have to cut there as well. So I think those are the two things, Chairperson, that I would like to put across, and I really want to hear them what to say. But as I say, I see the total collapse of the capitalist system, and therefore I think the state needs to take a very, very central role in the running of the economy. Perhaps they may also comment on that. Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Mkiva. Honorable Njandu, you're next.
Thank you very much, Chair. And also my apology for, I've got an item here but, on the, to raise my hand, but I don't know what the difficult is, but thank you very much, Chairperson. I appreciate. Chairperson, members, my input will be to the PBO. As a committee, we have got a role, an oversight role, to hold the executive accountable. My question will be, taking in consideration the proposals, what I want the PBO just to give 3 to 5 concrete steps that needs to be put in place by government department to ensure proper management of state resources in this difficult time of COVID-19. Chairperson, that will be my only question for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Honorable Njantu. Honorable Tutoit.
Thank you for the opportunity, Chair. Chair, I also want to appreciate both presentations of FFC and PBO. FFC, on slide 19, you said the recommendations, government should consider the following balance sheets: assets of the PIC, the GPF, UIF, and the South African Reserve Bank foreign exchange reserves. Would you please elaborate on this and provide clarity on your suggestion? Secondly, the FFC welcomes economic transformation. This is a great concern, Chair. In effect, the current model, which government tries to transform the economy instead of stimulating the economy for simultaneous stabilization and systematic growth, it is unwise to focus on the current growth model that is currently on the table. FFC also mentioned that an estimated 1 to 1.5 million job losses will be incurred during this time as a result of COVID, but a large part of these job losses are as a result of the current lockdown regulations that we have, that were imposed by government, and also as a result of this radical economic transformation. I want to make it clear that it isn't sustainable for government to proceed with this current model, since we will not be able to carry all the UIF payouts as well as the social grants that will be that they need to pay out as a result of these job losses. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Honorable Tutoit. Estelle and Lubabalo, any other hand? None so far.
No, none so far, Chairperson.
Estelle, nothing from you?
No, Chairperson, nothing on the meeting chat.
Thank you. Honorable members, thank you for your valuable inputs. And I think in this discussion, we are really preparing ourselves and also giving ideas in terms of what National Treasury needs to do in terms of focusing on the pandemic that we are faced with, the COVID-19 budget. We are being empowered as a committee to can make better contributions and being aware of where we can make input. I have few issues that I want to raise, honorable members. We still have a bit of time. I'll start with the FFC on slide 20. The FFC presentation speaks about the unhealthy composition of expenditure and the need to rethink some of the budget cuts, which have impacted on certain departments such as peace and security and public administration. This is what is on the slide. Now, my question is, what specific budget department does the Commission think needs to be reviewed in terms of reducing major budget cuts? Like I said, that we are in this process. We are dealing with this 2020 Appropriation Bill, which was presented earlier this year. But then we still have something else that we need to, another appropriation that we need to focus on. So these engagements will assist us in that scenario. And still on FFC, given the real growth depth of 7.4%, which is higher than expenditure growth in some government departments, which specific measures or steps does the Commission propose for government in order to stabilize government debt without taking resources away from social programs? Because we know in terms of social programs, when we talk about social programs, we are talking about the disadvantaged, the most vulnerable sector of our country or our community. Thirdly, members, and still to FFC, given the fact that the Commissioner's view on the wage bill reform is that such reforms should be determined by the shape and the size of the public sector. And it's not for the first time that the Commissioner raises this, and we also have raised it, that what informs the size that we are aspiring? Is there scientific evidence in terms of the size that we want to have in the public service? So my question therefore again is, what informs the ideal shape and size of the public service, and how will this be determined, and whether the Commission does have a view in the early, we know there's been a talk about early retirement packages, and also the issue of the renewal of the wage bill at the PSCPC. Is it working? How can you assist in terms of this? We know when we had public hearings, COSATU, like Honorable Ryder has said, have made an input, and this is something that, in terms of the wage bill, the 601 or so, or 605 billion rand wage bill, is something that as a committee we cannot decide on, that it needs to be reversed. The three-year term agreement is something that employer and employees has to come to an understanding. But as an oversight body, we need to have a view coming from FFC in terms of this question that I've just raised. Whether is it? Do you think it will work, this issue of retirement packages? Because I know for a fact that the minister have encouraged for early retirement, but now we are faced with this pandemic that we are faced with, COVID-19, and we need those services that have retired. I don't know. The last one on FFC, slide 23. The Commission speaks about projected reduction on revenue performance on the 2021 budget period, and the preliminary assessment report indicates an under-recovery of about 9 billion rands in April 2020, reflecting a year-on-year decline of 8.8%, and corporate tax and specific excess duties are amongst the tax revenue under-recovery in the same period. Therefore, my question will be, what are the specific? I think to a certain extent, Honorable Jandu asked this question, but he directed it to PBO. So mine is, what are specific concrete steps or measures that the Commission can propose for the government to get the economy back on track, while at the same time fighting the scourge of the COVID-19? And what is it that the Commission thinks it has not been considered by government in its response to save lives and economy against the COVID-19? I think we have had many press conferences that the government, starting from the president, that the government is caught between economy and lives, and one has to be prioritized above the other, but they are equally important, so to say. So we need your view as the FFC in terms of that. Now that we are going to deal with the budget for COVID-19, we want to influence the budget as the minister and treasury are busy with it. I just hope we will be able to influence. On slide 4 for PBO, the presentation speaks about the budget reduction and expenditure cuts on specific programs to manage the growing debts. This is what is on your slide. And then my question is, does the PBO have any specific program in mind to be cut, and what will be the criteria of identifying such programs? Hence, I have said earlier that these presentations, they overlap. They speak one language, and according to me, I think they have something like a similar mandate to empower us as members of Parliament, public reps, members of this committee, to influence the decision that government is taking. My second question is whether there are mechanisms that can be put in place to ensure that such budget cuts do not have negative impacts on the service delivery. It speaks to my earlier question. So these mechanisms, do you have in place? Do you have something in place to make sure that, or to ensure that such cuts are not having a negative impact on service delivery? I think Honorable Letani spoke about this, and it also talks to what Honorable Njadu has spoken about in terms of the social or our social services. What should be done? That is the next question. What should be done in order to? It's still on the statement that is on slide 4. What should be done in order to stabilize the debt levels, and whether government has done enough to keep the debt levels manageable? That is the question. Let me not motivate it further, because I don't want to eat much on your time. Members might want to come for the second bite. My second question is on, or focus is on slide 6, honorable members, and PBO. The presentation speaks about the broad impact of COVID-19 on the South African economy. Hence, we spoke about the life and the economy being on the high priority, or on the level where influences whatever government does and whatever we do, all of us as South Africans. Therefore, the question following that statement on slide 6 is, what is PBO's view on the South African government's intervention to save lives against COVID-19, and what specific measures will the budget office advise this committee, in order to make sure that the economic situation is not worsened? We are relying on you to empower us. The next question is, what is the view of Parliamentary Budget Office on the 44 billion rands set aside for the assistance of the SOEs, and what will be the best alternative ways of recapitalization of SOEs with minimum cost to the state but yielding tangible results? We know all how we feel about the SOEs, the state of the SOEs, the way they are being managed, the view and the picture that is being painted in the public about SOEs. So we need your assistance in terms of this PBO, the 44 billion that is set aside to assist the SOEs. We know some of the SOEs have bottomless pit, so it's going to be difficult for us. But then we need your input or your view that will assist us to take the correct the correct decision or the correct advice in terms of advising Treasury. The next one is according to the PBO, what are the 5 Congress steps that needs to be put in place by government department to ensure proper management of state resources and avoid wasteful. The issue of the wasteful and fruitless expenditure. How do you think, what kind of management do you think we can put as PBO in order to prevent or to avoid the wastefulness or fruitless expenditure before we even approve the budget? I'm happy that in this meeting today we have the Auditor General's team where they hear what we feel as the Appropriations Committee and our concern. And what we want to see is value for money. And we have always been raising concerns about the issue of the fruitless and wasteful expenditure. So we are appealing to you as the Parliamentary Budget Office, as an independent or neutral. I don't know if it is anything neutral in this world, but I want to believe that your mandate is neutral and independent. You need to give us an advice or empower us to help in terms of making sure that we avoid the wasteful and fruitless expenditure. The next one is that the PBO overall perspective and its analysis or recommendations to the 2020 Appropriations Bill to ensure that this proposed allocation provide meaningful responses to COVID-19 without losing sight of addressing the triple challenges such as poverty, unemployment, and inequalities. I think everything that we are doing, we need to keep it behind our mind that we have Agenda 2063, we have the NDP, that these challenges that is facing South Africa, the issue of unemployment, which I think COVID-19 has contributed on it, the issue of poverty, COVID-19 has contributed to it, because if people lose jobs, then the poverty will be higher. The issue of inequality, that is a fact, that there are other people, as a country, we are not equal. There are those who, somebody in NA yesterday when they were debating, I think it's a Honorable Beard, when they were debating on the bill on social development, he quoted the issue of the animal farm issue, that other animals are more important than others. So it's a fact that we are an equal country, and it's a responsibility of this country, of this committee, of this government, and everybody who is in business, who is in labor, who is a member or a community member, to contribute in their way to make sure that we close the gap of the inequality amongst ourselves as the community. Thank you very much. I'm now going to allow the FFC to respond, and after that, PBO will come. We still have one item left after their responses. Thank you very much. FFC?
Thank you, Chairperson, and thank you, honourable members, for the questions and comments and responses. I wanna just remind the honourable members and chairs that last week we sent you the full narrative of the presentation, which in there we also articulate exactly what are the basis for some of the positions that we're putting forward. And I would urge you again, like I said in the beginning, to also read through the narrative, because within the narrative, it explains some of these things much more clearly in terms of some of the questions that were raised. That's the first thing. The second thing, my apologies, is that I think we shouldn't forget, and we should always be one of those lenses that we use. We're in a country where we have inequality uncomparable to other countries. We have stubborn poverty. And because of that, we are having problems with employment and unemployment. So the job losses, yes, it has greatly been affected by the COVID crisis. But what needs to be remembered is that the world is wrapped in uncertainty in terms of where we're going. There are lots of modeling and modelers that try to project how the economy is going to look like, the global economy relative to what's going to happen in South Africa. And our view is that we need to listen to the epidemiologists, because then they give us a number of models, but there's a couple of models that's coming close together to that. So if you're going to ask us some detailed questions about how do we see the health response to the question, how the response to it, we're giving you what we understand through our own interactions with health. And in the document, we've made clear as to why there's a need to bump up or ramp up expenditure or funding into the health sector to deal with the crisis. I think it's unfortunate that the current debate in South Africa and also now have picked up this greater binary nature of what comes first. Do we respond to the economy? Do we respond to the health crisis? Our view is simple. We're experiencing a human crisis here with the COVID. And the human crisis is about health. And if you don't have healthy people, then clearly those people cannot contribute to the economy in a meaningful way. And also, obviously it affects our human development index. So there's not we're not raising here binary issues. The point that I also raised earlier, some of the other things that we're fighting against as a whole nation and battling against, is that our sovereign rating has been downgraded, and as a result, it has an impact on finances and the fiscal space that our country is in, and also the borrowing question. So we shouldn't forget that is also a difficult thing that the government and the state needs to deal with, because of our borrowing capabilities across from government as a whole, as a sovereign, but also as it relates to government guarantees and loan to SOEs and that. What is very important is that we need to look at the economic growth and the strength of the country. There's the need to look at institutional strength, i.e. our institutions, the nature of our decision making and the productivity that those decisions is bringing to the fore to society, but also to its citizens. There's a need again to look at how do we rebuild our fiscal strength, looking of course of the pressures on our tax buoyancy and other revenues. And then the element that we need to think about, how do we manage domestic political risks that's affecting South Africa as a whole. These are the things that rating agencies look for in order for us to get out of this difficult spot that we are in. I want to say that our view is simply, in terms of the health shock, that, as I indicated, there will be numbers, there will be projections, the epidemiologists are talking about it. Until there's a vaccine, the global story is until there's a vaccine to deal with effectively deal with COVID, and how far South Africa stand in the line in terms of the discovery, the design, and also the production of the vaccine, testing, tracing, quarantine and overall surveillance will have to happen. We are in a period of winter. We don't know what's gonna happen. Some of our own epidemiologists are saying that we need to look at what's happening in August and September and the outcomes there. So we are in uncertainty. Let's not pretend collectively as a society that we are not in a difficult situation. We are in a difficult situation. If members also read through the narrative document, we don't put an ideological position on the role of the state here, because that's not our job. We are not elected. We're not elected Republican representatives that want to say that we're capitalists. We need to put a capitalist trajectory. We need to put a communist or socialist or state-controlled trajectory or greater state involvement in the economy. That's not our job. We're not elected. Those that are elected need to put those particular positions to the fore. We're giving you a pragmatic view on what we think needs to happen. Hence, our document gives, and our presentation suggests to you what is the criteria to a particular criteria or standard of measure, or some will call it a litmus test, in terms of how you need to determine the reprioritization. And part of that is there is a case to be made that certain programs need to close down. And that we need to use those resources to respond to two crises that we have. In fact, three crises that we have. We have a crisis that we carry on during the apartheid years to now, which is about inequality and poverty. There's the crisis of COVID to deal with that, and then there's obviously the economic crisis around what has actually happened with the South African state and its economy. So that's the criteria we put into the fore. The next point I want to raise about what's the role of the state. In the documents and in the presentation, we did say that the state, in these difficult circumstances that we find ourselves, we need to expand public spending. And when we say that, we said, let's invest. Let's look for those new, the ones that is great, use productivity in the South African society, the ones where we know that where employment will be secured. Let's look at those economic growth activities and invest in them. But let's also put innovative ideas to the fore, that we bring in new economies into the space so that our people can become more productive and employed. Part of that is a need to invest in the digital economy. We've seen the digital economy expand. We've seen that there's a new way of looking at the retail economy in South Africa. There's a need to look at the digitization of health services, digitization of education. Our children, what is also meaning around increased health spending. If you look at it, some of our children have been sitting in classrooms of 50 to 60 and even more than that. Clearly with COVID, it says we can't have those classrooms anymore. We need to relook at education as an activity. We need to look at how we protect our children and even their families from further spread of the COVID disease, the COVID pandemic, right, the virus. So as a result, classrooms need to change, and that's an investment that needs to be made. Schooling needs to change, and the way we do schooling needs to change. Gauteng is quite ahead in terms of how it's rolling out iPads to schools. We need to start saying we need to do that, but we need to bring down the cost of data. And that's where we're saying that there's a role for the state to play. And much more forcefully the state needs to play. We're also saying that we also said that there's a need to relook at income support. We've got the social grant system. There's a COVID social grants been spoken about. But there are also other opportunities that we need to bring social relief to families, for social relief of distress, not the one that has been defined in terms of the Social Assistance Act, but there's a need for social relief to families and communities and for businesses. And when we talk about social protection, we are actually saying that the state must play the central role in social protection. So again, it's a matter of where the state needs to invest in productive spending to be able to protect our our families, communities, but also our economies. When we raise the issue on infrastructure, I think it's on record that what we're saying. We don't say cut infrastructure spending. All that we're saying, because of the dire need for fiscal resources, there are infrastructure planning that is at the pre-feasibility stage. There's also those that are still in the procurement system. And all that we're saying, we need to review. We need to review with a view to find those fiscal resources to be able to invest in dealing with firstly the human crisis and secondly the economic crisis. And that's also a role for the state. So if effectively we are also saying that there is a need for a greater role for the state to play around that. And this, Chair, before I hand over to Shane and Nkululeko just to take the other points, I think that the whole conversation on the wage bill has, in our view, has been pushed back in a big way. Because clearly COVID says to us, we're going to need more doctors, we're going to need more nurses, we're going to need more of those general workers within hospitals, in schools, we're going to need more teachers, we're going to need more social welfare workers to assist in dealing with the consequences of COVID. So it suggests that the whole conversation that we used to have on the wage bill, and the fact that I just said to you there's going to be a need for greater social public spending, that the wage bill conversation is going to have to take a backseat for us to redefine again over and over what ought to be the shape and size of the public service in relation to the constitutional functions of the state, in relation to the administrative functions of the state, in relation to the role of the state in social and economic infrastructure and services. Those are the criteria that we need to look at when we look at the size and the shape of the public service. Chair, you raised the issue of the retirement packages and people taking early retirement. Financial sectors has also been affected by the COVID crisis, and the value of people's investments has also been affected. So I think even that policy stance of people taking early retirement, early packages, people think rationally some of those decisions that people cannot put on hold, because will their savings be able to stretch beyond their retirement? Those are key questions that people are asking, and which the economy needs to address to be able to do that. So, Chair, can I quickly hand over to Nkululeko and Shen to respond? Shen will first respond, and then Nkululeko will respond afterwards. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chair, honourable members. So just to answer in a rather brief manner some of the questions posed. So the South African Reserve Bank, their estimates of that a contraction of 6.1 was posted in April 14th of this year. So, and the basis of that assumption or projection is all around the monetary stimulus, specifically around the repo rate cuts, and as a monetary stimulus to the economy. And that is, by our estimation, is reasonable in a sense that, and given the timing of it, is reasonable because monetary stimulus, as we know, is faster than fiscal stimulus. In both economic and empirical evidence is that, and we can see it immediately, right? Mortgage payments immediately goes down, some tax holidays and liquidity in the markets that makes the flow of credits much faster and therefore stimulating the economy. So that, in that sense, is it was reasonable, and why, whether it lags or not lag at the moment, I think, as you can see, given the wide variances in the uncertainty that are on the table by various projections, I think it speaks for itself why it's only one of the many, right, estimates that are put out there. I guess as our chairperson have actually raised this at the standing committee, is that it's quite unfortunate that notice how many of these estimations are done by also international institutions rather than of our own analysis and our own data. In terms of the health response, I think it's as our chairperson already emphasized. It's a specialist field of, and specifically to the health sector. But I think looking globally and also in answering Honorable Karim's points, is that, who's going to be responsible if South Africa should fall into the case like Brazil or America, if we just slack on this point in terms of this balance. It's a delicate balance, and this is an unprecedented crisis that we're all facing. So it's not a binary discussion. That's the ultimate point. In terms of the debt, stabilization of the debt, and also earlier honourable member said about whether the public sector should come to the fore. The question that I think and also in relation to the cuts, how the government cuts and controls its spending and so on. The question here, I think, is that the stance is that the more we are able to reprioritize within some ceiling or within some limits, right, the less we are exposed to external risks or debt sustainability crisis. So in that vein, as much as, and now this is where it becomes technical, is that as much or as useful as the composite measure of that debt to GDP ratio is, the question, I think, which is more nuanced, is all the behind the scene variables, specifically the GDP growth, the exchange rates, the cost of borrowing, which is the main driver of why the sustainability of debt is a problem, and as well as, most importantly, the one closest to government's control is the fiscal credibility, as I mentioned earlier. It's how this government is able or not able to rein in expenditure, control your deficit, right? Because that sends out a strong signal to rating agencies to whether we are able to sustain and maintain that fiscal credibility when the time is needed, when the time is a cause for it. I think I'll hand over right now to Dr. Ngube with the last point. Is I think a lot of the discussions we need to. It's about how we understand economic restructuring as a country and as South Africans. It's how we understand sort of restructuring through reorganizing institutions, the way we do things, the activities. This doesn't just focus on the public sector, although that is why we are here. It's about public sector in the main, but the private sector obviously also do their own restructuring. The way they operate, they also been working at home, things like that. And then the way they transact, they engage with their customers also have changed. So in our sense, public sector is how we also affect the cuts. So the cuts is not just a blanket binary approach. It's also how we make the cut, or how we prioritize certain activities. And earlier you heard the chairperson already mention the example of infrastructure, right? I think it's not about holding back infrastructure or cutting infrastructure as a whole, but it's a question about between water, sanitation, and refuse infrastructure, the basic services infrastructure, or some of the priority service infrastructure that delivers vital public values right now, health, for example, versus that to, say, airports, luxuries, and some other other activities that, given because of COVID, they need to think how they restructure themselves. And one in particular, as a country, is this is supposed to give us, COVID-19 is supposed to give us the opportunity to localize a lot of the production processes and value chain processes in South Africa. And that is something I think this government should definitely focus its attention on, is because of COVID, we localize and bring it back in, or rely on ourselves, not on others, or not on overseas imports. I hand over to Dr. Ntube.
Thank you. I think I'll answer perhaps one question which has been partly alluded to. It is about the recovery of the economy, because we are really into uncharted territory in terms of projections. We find that recovery in some cases has been estimated that initially we estimated that recovery would be quick. We get what some people call a V-shaped recovery process. But as projections come in now, and many people are thinking that we may have some delayed recovery because of many interventions or many changes, both domestically and internationally. I want to look at the international dimension, which Honorable Karim alluded to. That looking at the international scene, we have seen that in 2020, quick recovery is becoming more elusive now, because we see globally big economies are still going deeper and deeper into economic growth is getting lower and lower. If you look at the United States, they're estimating that it may go deeper into contract by almost 8%, the EU 8%. Only China may probably recover towards the end of the year. So this quick recovery is becoming more elusive now. It may be delayed, and we see that it will also depend on the stimulus packages in other countries, not only what we do here alone, but in other countries, how effective are these stimulus packages especially in those countries we are trading with. It's only China which is now showing some bit of recovery as one of our big export markets. So in terms of COVID, it has really put us into uncharted territory, and projections are really difficult. But pointing out to that maybe we may have some delayed recovery depending on the packages which are being put in other countries, as well as our structural reform, as has been pointed out here. Then I think that was one of the questions I wanted to allude to. Thank you.
Chairperson, just the last comment, I left this one for last, is that Honorable Ryder asked about the whole question about food and agriculture and that. We agree that the state needs to redefine its role in terms of agriculture and food security. We also agree that we need to look at the incentivizing of farmers, especially emerging farmers, however it gets defined, but also commercial farmers, and see exactly how do we firstly create an element, a productive element that suggests firstly food availability for South Africa and food security for South Africa. So we do think that food, given what has happened currently, the cost of food is going up, and access to it, that agriculture, food security, and the whole production value chain when it comes to agriculture needs to be looked at. And there needs to be a greater role there that of investment and creating incentives in that environment. So we agree with that. And I think it's an important thing that we've seen that food availability for our citizens is becoming a problem in certain areas. So that's the last point that we wanted to make on that. Thank you, Chair. I yield time back to you.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you very much. And your team, FFC, can I now hand over to PBO?
Okay. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, FFC. I think a lot of what was said we agree with, and I will add to that. I want to start with the question of the broader economy and the global economy issues. Honorable Karim asked about how South Africa compares to other developing countries. Now, the UN brought out the World Economic and WESP, the World Economic and something prospects, looking at what the impact of COVID at the end of April. And the estimates there was that that world GDP growth will drop by minus 3.2%. That of developed countries will be minus 5%. That of developing countries will be minus 0.7%. For Africa as a whole, it would be minus 1.6%. And for sub-Saharan Africa, it would be minus 3.5%. Now, I've also looked at the end of April, the IMF did a report on the impact on sub-Saharan African countries in an outlook. And there they were showing the impacts on oil-producing countries, other countries that produce and that are more dependent on other commodities and resources, including South Africa, and countries that are dependent on tourism. And we see for the oil and the commodity countries, they're expecting a drop in growth of 3%, so minus 3% GDP growth. For the ones that are more dependent on tourism, it's going to be minus 5%. For the ones that are not dependent on tourism, oil or resources, which are very few of us, there will actually be positive growth in sub-Saharan Africa, according to the IMF. So we're going to see these different kinds of effects. And we see that South Africa, a large part of sub-Saharan Africa's decline is going to be linked to the decline in South Africa. Now, Honorable Karim was correct that our recovery is going to depend a lot on what's happening in the global economy, and members, including Honorable Karim, spoke about this sort of insularity that's developing. What we're seeing already is that with China, as they bringing more production online, they actually have increased exports, but they're actually not increasing it. They imports as much, and other countries actually, even though they still dependent on some of China's exports, aren't importing as much. And so the Chinese, even though the economy is starting to wake up from the parts of the pandemic, they still going to be expecting that. And that, I think, is also a sign of what's going to happen with South Africa's recovery. And it brings me to the question of the health and the economy issues, because this idea that if we through open the economy, even if there are health impacts, people are going to be better off. But that's something that I think I agree with FFC, to not look at it so much as a binary trade-off, but to look at the two, and especially also in the way we see government responding, as the two as very much interlinked. And that South Africa is going to be affected by what's happening in our neighboring countries, in their economies, as fairly large customers of ours and trade partners and economic partners, but also in the rest of the world in our other major partners. The demand for our mining and minerals exports will probably be low. I'm sure many companies around the world are sitting on fairly high inventories now of those goods, given the drop in demand. Now, taking into account those issues, we also need to look at the possibility of second wave impacts. And so, and the way that we're seeing businesses have to close down, or branches of businesses have to close down, if there are few infections. And so even if we are going to throw open things, we are going to see we're going to see impacts on businesses and the ability to especially with people in factories, in mines, in those in hospitals, those areas where one or two infections can actually cause businesses to close down for sometimes up to 14 days. So we are going to see those kinds of impacts as well. So it's really hard to estimate the impacts and also estimate the impacts of opening up or maintaining a more kind of controlled process of opening up. The other area is I've been reading about is herd immunity, because a lot of people are arguing that if we open up, more and more people will get infected, and that a relatively small percentage of those people end up getting that serious impacts from the epidemic, and eventually will develop herd immunity. And the stuff I've been reading has been saying that over the next 2 years or so, given maybe the length of when it will get a vaccine, most countries are unlikely to develop herd immunity. The number of infections you need within the space of time for that to happen is not going to be enough. And so we are going to get these waves happening. So we have to be fairly careful in that sense. Now, the issue of the impact on social spending and debt stabilization. So maybe I should take a step back. So what we do know from the world and South Africa is that, the COVID and the responses to COVID, like the lockdown and social distancing, is going to cause basically dead weight losses. These aren't losses that we can recover. They basically, the economies have largely, or large parts of them, have closed down, and these losses are going to be with us, and the losses we have to recover from in terms of GDP growth, in terms of value added, in terms of businesses being closed down, struggling to get up, in terms of job losses. And so we're going to have to work our way back up from that. And so the pandemic and these kind of events, things like natural disasters, etc., are special in that case. They're different from the global financial crisis, where if there's an argument that if countries had not moved towards fiscal consolidation and austerity so quickly after the global financial crisis, but kept stimulating the impacts of the financial crisis, would have been much less. Now, that argument, I think, is valid for our responses from COVID-19, but we have to add into the mix the fact that they are going to be deadweight losses that will be with us through the medium term, and that our responses to that will have to take into account then how we respond in the medium term and over the longer term. And then that brings me also to the discussion and questions people have raised about then what is the role of government and the state, and also including the size of the public sector and the wage bill. Now, I think we are going to have to consider our planning, and as our medium-term planning, but also our longer-term planning carefully, because I think the one important lesson that now has broad agreement across the globe is that we shouldn't move towards fiscal consolidation too soon. We should plan over time to move towards trying to bring the fiscal balance and debt under control, and not to try and do that too quickly, because what we learned from, including South Africa with fiscal consolidation, is that fiscal consolidation becomes a constraint on growth. And in our slide in the beginning, one of the points we made was that sorry, I'm just trying to get my train of thought back, was that even with the reductions in the budget and spending on certain issues and reprioritization leading up to the 2020 budget, we still didn't see the debt to GDP reducing. And added to that, the points we made about over at least from 2015-16 reductions or fairly flat spending on social on services and things like housing, amenities, water, health, education. And so we are going to have to think about how we manage to maintain and possibly increase some of that spending, and look at the bringing the level of the debt under control over a longer period. And one of the issues there is to think about what the role of government is, and not to think about government in the same way we think about our households, and that we have to keep matching revenue and expenditure, and that government has a fairly large impact on the economy through its investments and through its what we call government consumption, a lot of which is actually investment in community and in infrastructure and other and services and efficiency and effectiveness of those services. And if we take together government and public sector corporations, we're looking at about 30% of GDP, and that money is important to be spent in the economy at a time when we expect to see lots of job losses and businesses struggling and probably increasing bankruptcies. So we really need to think about the planning and the spending in responses to that. And when we think about debt stabilization doesn't mean bringing the debt down to a certain level in a year or two. We should think about this as a long term. And here, there are two issues that are important. The first one, yes.
Sorry, Doctor. Can I request that when you respond, you just mind our time? We still have other items to deal with.
Okay.
And we are given only 3 hours.
I'm sorry. This will be this will be my last point before I hand over to my colleague Nelia for her. Sorry, Chair. On debt, I think what we've seen, especially from Africa, but there's a call globally, and in Africa and the African Union, our president has been one of the spokespeople calling for the poorest countries for debt forgiveness and debt write-offs and repackaging debt. But I think overall, for developing countries, there's going to be a need, and that we're not alone in this. We're going to have to look at how globally our developing country debt is dealt with, and how we respond to the increasing debt because of the extra expenditure government has had to take on. And I think over the next few years, we'll still have to inject into economies to help with the recovery. The second thing is on credit rating agencies, which I think is really important. I think we're seeing already, we started seeing it even before the pandemic. There was people were starting to respond negatively to the credit ratings agencies and how they were treating that. With COVID-19, there was within the Financial Times and The Economist and other, I think, outlets that sort of represent mainstream thinking. There was I think a level of people being upset about the multi-notch decreases in credit ratings, not only of governments and their debt, but of businesses as well. And very large businesses are also responding to that. And so I think we need to take that into account in our responses about how we deal with debt, and that the credit ratings agencies, one is haven't always been right, and two is that they're not the most sensitive people in the times of hardship, and there's now a global response to that, and that we should take advantage of that. Thank you. I'm going to pass on to my colleague Milian to carry on. Sorry for taking too long, Chair.
So there's still someone else to
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, Chair. I just gonna quickly. Good afternoon. Good morning, honourable members, and I just wanna quickly run through some of the points. I think just to add on my colleague what he was saying. Yesterday there was a inter-parliamentary union meeting where coronavirus recovery and some of the issues were discussed, and strongly what came in the discussion between various parliaments in the world was that the role of government is seen as an important role in addressing, in managing the virus as in consequences that will lead to better recoveries of economies globally. And I think the role of government in accelerating spending on infrastructure is one of the keystone of recoveries in economies globally, and parliaments were somehow encouraged to oversight governments ensuring that the spending on infrastructure, both economic and social infrastructure, should be accelerated, and also the important role of supporting household consumptions, particularly the low household consumptions, was seen as the key factors there. One other point I wanted to quickly highlight on was on the 5 points that were required by Honourable Njadi and Honourable Chair as well, was around proper management. One of the big 2 points I want to mention there, the issue of compliance with relevant provisions, in particular your supply chain and PFMA. We've seen recently the reports that there's been a tendency by some of the local governments to abuse or to override the SCM processes. And I think if there's an area where oversight should be improved, it's within that compliance with provisions. And I think AG has mentioned that as well, but also making sure that there's proper support at the regional and local level of spending infrastructure, and helping municipalities and local governments in ensuring they achieve those. One quick point on SOEs. I think the issue around SOE is very important, and there won't be a shortcut to deal with it. There need to be long-term, short-term, or medium-term approach to it, and we've raised this before, that there need to be a clear indication what are commercial mandates of the SOEs, and that needs to be costed. And on short-term, they probably need to be reviewed of some of the SOE business model considering economic context we're in at this stage, and also ensure that there's proper stability in the SOEs governance structures in that regard. I think there are a lot of points, but I'll just leave there, Chair. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, PBO. Honourable members, I thought we will save time so that I give you second bite, but I think time is not on our side. Can I check that members are satisfied with the questions, the answers given by PBO and what's this? FFC, and also try to find from Treasury if they want to speak. They want to comment, actually. Treasury, do you want to comment? Lubabalo, is there no one? Have they left?
Chairperson, Eunice.
Okay, Comrade Eunice.
Just to suggest that if there are any outstanding issues, perhaps they can, as we often do, because it's 11:59 now, they can write in. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. I wanted it to come from the members, but I still feel that Treasury needs to comment on these inputs. But if they have left the platform, we can continue. Treasury is no one.
I can't recognize anyone from Treasury, Chairperson. Okay. I don't see the normal face names that I know from amongst the guests, Chair.
Okay. Okay. With that, let me take this opportunity to thank the honourable members of this committee, Select Committee on Appropriation, the support staff, I have a special name for you. Some might be aware, but it's not a secret. I call you the 18 because we come across problems, but at the end of the day, we are able to find each other and resolve those issues. I also want to thank FFC, PBO for availing yourself and responding to the issues that we have raised. And with that, let me confirm what Honorable Karim has said. Honorable members, if there are issues that you think are not answered, please, through the Secretariat, raise those issues and they'll be sent to the relevant office or the relevant institution for response, so that our report, when we deal with our report, it must be inclusive of everything that we have discussed. It must be a reflection of the discussions and the processes that we have taken as a committee. I also want to take this opportunity to thank members of the media, other stakeholders, and also those who were in the platform unknown. With those few words, I want to release these stakeholders, this participant, and remain with the members of the committee and the support staff to finalize the 3 items. And I think we are going to be very quick on it. It's one item actually, and 3 sub-items in one. Thank you very much, Prof. Doctors from PBO. Thank you so much. Honorable members, we have 3 sets of meeting. Am I audible?
Yes, Chairperson.
Yes, Chair.
Thank you. We will start with the set of the minutes of the 27th of May 2020. These minutes were sent to us last week. This one actually it was way before last week. On the first page, anything? On page 2, and please, if I'm quick, let me know. Page 3, page 4. That was the last page. Can I get a mover for the adoption?
Eunice moves. Yeah, I move. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Karim. A seconder?
I second.
Honorable Jadu. Thank you for seconding. We are now going to the minutes of the 3rd of June 2020, page 1. Page 2. Page 3. Page 4. And page 5. Can I get a mover?
I'll move, Chairperson. Eunice, thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Karim. Seconder?
I'm moving, Chair. Jadu.
I seconding. It has been moved by Eunice. Seconding.
Let me second both of them, Chairperson.
Thank you very much. We are going to the last set of the minutes of the 5th of June 2020, also visual meeting platform. On page 1, page 2, honorable members. Page 3. Page 4. Page 5. Page 6. That's the last page. Can I get a mover?
Chairperson, Eunice, I move. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Eunice. Karim? A seconder?
Chairperson,
Yes.
let me second Comrade Karim.
Thank you very much, Honorable Mkiva, for seconding. Also, let me take this opportunity to thank you once more for the contributions you have made, triggering all the challenges that are facing us and making sure that as a committee, we are not just taking things for granted, we are being empowered. We use the opportunity before us to engage on issues so that we are better empowered in terms of our responsibilities. And thank you very much for availing yourselves. I know that the timing, we start very early. We usually start at 10 when we are in Parliament, but these days we start early, and sometimes we'll be starting late. It's all because the management of Parliament is giving us slots. Only 3 visual meetings can take place at the same time. So don't be surprised sometime that we are to meet in the afternoon or the evening. It wouldn't be because of my choice. It will be because of the pressure that Parliament is getting. Thank you very much, honorable members. Lastly, let me take this opportunity as the chairperson of Appropriation and request all the members that when you, starting from tomorrow, when you log into any platform, either Microsoft or Zoom, please to avoid what I have seen in the sitting of NA yesterday. When you log in, write your names, rename your gadgets, your full name and surname, and the party that you represent. That will make no harm to anyone, so that we are not giving pressure to our leadership in Parliament. Let's just also make life easier for ourselves as well. Thank you very much. Take care of yourselves and the ones you love.
Chairperson?
Okay, yes.
So sorry, Chair. I was just wondering whether there was the possibility of the program being revised for next week, the meeting day, to adopt the report. I was wondering whether there was going to be an announcement on that, the meeting on Monday, possibly.
Oh, by the way, there was a meeting today of a programming committee. Is it programming committee or WIPARI? Jadu? Was it? Okay. There was a meeting that took place, but thank you, Estelle, for reminding me. Because of the request that we got.
Hello, Chair.
Hello? I'm fine, sir. I'm fine. Because of the request that I got from the national chairperson of the National Council of Provinces and the minister, in terms of fast-tracking our program, we have, or I'm requesting, after I have requested the relevant authority in the NCOP, that we meet on Monday to deal with the report, because the NA is dealing with the report, has dealt with the report today, and they are adopting in today's sitting, if I'm not mistaken, or Friday. But this week they're finalizing the appropriation bill. So therefore, I was of the opinion that we should have a meeting on Monday, whereby we finalize the report, we debate the report and finalize the report, and thereafter we can be able to give members an opportunity to prepare themselves for the debates and other issues that they want to report to their respective political parties. That is the request that I have, the view that I have. for us to be responsive to the request. Honorable members, can I hear you? It's more of an announcement, I think.
It's agreed, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I think it's practical, Chair.
Thank you very much. The Secretariat will send you the invite and the relevant time and the connection. Thank you so much. Take care of yourselves. Go well.
Keep well, everybody.